Welcome to No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We're here today with Greg MacDougall and Steve Saunders. They are the brains behind Government Analytics, a company designed to help Canadians make sense of big government data. Literally thousands of pages of information that the government collects on just about anything you can imagine. And of course, it usually sits on a shelf. Steve is a software analyst who has co-founded tech companies and worked at IBM. And Greg has been advising governments and professionals on public policy and risk assessment for over 30 years. Okay, so here's from your latest report: Canada's household debt, corporate debt, not-for-profit debt, federal debt, provincial debt, and now municipal debt is among the highest in the G7. The COVID costs are going to continue for a while. Can we sustain this?
No. The difference here is, and I like to use the analogy of the Parisian condo, all right? The home or the apartment in Paris, that where the mortgage gets handed down from generation to generation. Mm-hmm. Now, I have no idea if that's true. It's just a myth I've heard somewhere along the line. It makes sense to me because the square footage of an apartment or condo in Paris is probably a hell of a lot more than in Saskatchewan. Yeah. And the only reason I say that is, if Canadians accept that may be the reality, I think, sure, yeah, we can sustain. I think so. But it's this transition that's going to occur, and neither Steve or I are economists. Right? But is the silent liquidation, the silent insolvency that's going to quietly happen is really going to hurt. Because, and so the people that go through that, like, how long can restaurants hang on? Exactly. And then, and like, this isn't rocket science. And then they're asked to come back and only put half the chairs in the restaurant. Right. Well, and then they might be shut down again. And the margins were so low to begin with. Right. So it's moving us away. If we do anything, it's moving us away from this discussion about GDP ratio to and so on, and just saying, look, there are real people here. Does that actually mean anything? Because governments always use it as a defense that our debt to GDP ratio is in really good shape compared to everybody else, blah, 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 in the G7. Does that mean anything anymore when I think what the numbers I saw, it's up to 166% our debt is a portion of GDP, right? And so and that's where others, the reason we said it was one of the highest in the G7 is because we have data to show that. Yeah. And in the report you were speaking about that's weekly, we had right below that assertion the graphic that showed that, yes, indeed, it was the highest in the G7. So it means stuff to people who it needs to mean stuff to. Yeah. But as we've discovered through we go and find data everywhere. So StatsCan says that local economies are driven by 80 to 90% of small business. Mm-hmm. And so we're talking about Lethbridge and Saskatoon, Moose Jaw, Wadena. I missed the D. Wadena. And so in that same report, we identified 5 cities: Paradise, Newfoundland, High River, right. Wadena, Miramichi, and St. Hyacinthe in Quebec. Right. And we went in and we looked at their fiscal budgets.
Their revenue.
Tax
total
revenue.
Tax revenue to total revenue.
And you're asking us, and you're asking the question, does the GDP to income, does the ratio mean anything there? And I can tell you it probably means a lot less. Yeah. And it means a lot less because the companies that are going to shut down quietly, and because what happens with these things, it's sad, it hasn't happened to me, is you go into receivership. And then you call someone, and the lawyers know this, and the guys show up and say, put your pens down. And then they escort you to the door. Yeah. And I buy ice cream at the Mary Dairy here in Ottawa, which is a fabulous place to get to buy ice cream. And I'm talking to the owner, and he said, Tracy's went under. And I said, what? Tracy's Dairy in Renfrew. On long weekend. The supplier, of course. The supplier, family business, 80 years. Nobody knew. Yeah. And now it's not Hertz Rent-A-Car. It's not in the headlines. And this is a small little company, hires kids, and they have to, their supply, he said, and in big words, like the guys with the GDP to ratio talk about, the supply chain is volatile for the ice cream producers in Ottawa. And that volatility exists straight up to the Bank of Canada. So our report and the value of our report is that nobody looks at the Bank of Canada. They're up to $500 billion, $500 billion in purchases on behalf of the people of Canada.
They're trying to keep the provinces from going bankrupt. So
They're trying to
buying their debt, as it were.
There's $8 billion
Yeah.
for that, and there's $450 billion going into the banks so they stay liquid.
Wow.
In the small community of Adina and Paradise, the liquidity is driven by the small businesses.
Exactly.
In the banks,
Who were forced to shut their doors
yeah,
and didn't
No.
qualify for government programs because they were mom and pop shops, husband and wife run the bakery.
or they have to eat humble pie and go get income support.
Right.
And they've never been wanting to do that all their life, and they told their kids they shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And yet so it's very complicated, and the volatility is very, very real.
Yeah.
And so for guys like us who are two Joes who are doing this datalytics stuff, we get really grumpy when the retiring governor of the Bank of Canada says, well, we can see some things turning around. And I'm sure you can,
Yeah.
but it's really, really hard.
Fast enough and where.
Yeah.
We were talking about this a little earlier. So head of CMHC, Evan Siddle, says household debt. So these are people. This is what it's going to mean in my house and yours. Household debt could reach more than 200% of disposable income. Most people think we're already there. Jack Mintz says we've hit 3.2 trillion in our debt burden. Like these are numbers that people can't imagine. But if you are spending 200% of your disposable income, it can't last.
A number of things. Jack Mintz is the economist of the University of Calgary, is speaking in an echo chamber for a number of years.
Yeah.
Right? It's really sad. Debt is the issue, and it isn't the debt to GDP ratio for the federal government. It's the combination of all of them, and that's what we try and bring
Right.
to the table. The other part of this is you and I went through the 90s where Mr. Martin and Mr. Kretschmer, who used to back when say, oh, the deficit, that it didn't matter. And then he was challenged with dealing with it because of the Wall Street Journal said something about Mexico and the peso and the Canadian dollar and all that stuff.
Yep.
And then within a few short days, not unlike March that we experienced, but not as bad, Mr. Martin went around slashing. And I have never had a family doctor since then. I go to clinics because there are real outcomes.
Yep.
And so there are going to be real outcomes as a result of what happened in March.
Well,
but we're not talking about it.
This is the problem. We were talking about recovery projects and is our recovery going to be green and all these nice things. But this is putting Humpty Dumpty back together again in a very, very complicated
And Humpty
way.
Dumpty's going to look a lot different.
And it's going to look very, very different. And some of what we all do is not going to exist anymore. So how do we start to do that? I mean, you're number crunching, you're looking, and I want to raise the infrastructure issue because people said that at the beginning, this is the time now. Build highways and get that pipeline done. And
Shovel-ready infrastructure.
Shovel-ready infrastructure. So I read the other day that there are 20,000 infrastructure projects that the minister has declared are out there, and actually there's 52, but the story was about 20. And nobody can find them. The parliamentary budget officer's going, I don't know, we don't have any record of this. Are we actually doing any infrastructure projects at this crucial time?
So I've been looking at this infrastructure since 2016. I did 2016, 17, 18, and then I took a look at it in 2020. So in 16, 17, 18, for the Finance Committee, the data I had was Infrastructure Canada, but it turns out that that's only the projects they manage, and I think it was in 2017, 18, the federal government was trying to push infrastructure spending, and they said individual departments were going to manage their own infrastructure project. Well, that data is just, you can't find it anywhere. It's not publicly available. So,
and it's border security and it's agriculture,
Yeah,
it's everything.
There are 31 departments.
Wow.
That in 2016 they announced out of the blue, and I know it's an election or something, that 31 departments will be. So you have Infrastructure Canada, as Steve articulated, doing this bang-up job, And then you have the poor, and literally, the poor guys at Indigenous Services
Right.
who are going through a restructuring. Health Canada that's going through restructuring because 70% of their department's going to Indigenous Services. And in the back chamber somewhere is someone stuck with managing their infrastructure projects. So how do you get data out of them?
How do you exactly?
So the PBO agreed to do a survey of all these, all departments to get all their project data, and then they were kind enough to pass it along. So then I could compile a more comprehensive picture. And it turns out, I think it was 37% of the total number of projects came in addition, well, it was 37% of the 100 of the total what came from additional departments. So that's information that I didn't have before. Gives you a more comprehensive picture. The thing is, what I found when that data came in was, I mean, these are departments that aren't used to doing this.
Right.
It was a mess. Like the data was a mess, right? Like the places were misspelled and maybe in the wrong province, and so I had to clean it up a lot. I mean, not their fault. I mean, they're not used to managing this stuff, right?
So that's the gap.
Amazing.
That's where, and Steve was working, we were in different camps at that point, but Steve was, and when I say that, different employers, working for the committee at National Finance,
Right.
And so the PBO was giving the committee some of their findings that he was crunching. It wasn't our firm at that time.
Right.
And so, and that's where they get exasperated. And our firm, we go and look for data. We go and try and find raw data. We don't speak to anything that isn't. We're not opinionated in that
Right.
sense. And so that's, I guess, led to more of the creation of what we're doing.
But I'm coming back to
Yeah.
this question, like, are there infrastructure projects out there? You say that there are, it just, we may not be able to find it through the
Yes.
data, and
Yeah.
therefore people can't explain it.
Right. So for sure. So the last time PBO did a survey was in 2018. And so at that time, I just have here 2018 approved projects since April 1st, 2016 was 11,631 April 2018. So that was the last time I had a comprehensive list of infrastructure projects. January, when I did it again, January, it was just the Infrastructure Canada data.
Okay.
And so they had 5,967. So it dropped from, 11,600 to 6,000, like about 50% drop. But that's just because I don't have access to all the data from all the departments. And I'm sure it's increased since 2008, it's 2 years ago. But that's sort of the void that I have.
So money's out there. There are projects somewhere. We see activity here, there, and everywhere. So it's funded by somebody, usually in part by government, when you're so that they can put big signs up. All governments love to do that. We just don't know if it's targeting the problem. If we're actually,
or you don't really know if the project exists. And I'm not saying it doesn't. You take it at the word of the official, whoever the official is.
And it may exist on paper. It may be
and it would have to. I've been in departments all my life, and it does.
Yeah.
But when we deal with Infrastructure Canada, we don't take it at face value because the data is public. It's there. We know it. We can point to it. So one of the sources we get, and you were talking about this earlier, is one of the reasons we exist is because 3, 4, 5 years ago, the government decided to create this thing called Open Canada. So they unload data sets by the bucketful, truckloads of it, and it's there, and we just go in and crunch it. But what we're telling you is some departments around infrastructure, the 30, only one of the 31, are putting their data out there.
Right.
And
so we just don't know on the other.
And so it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It just means we can't cross-reference it. And more importantly, like we can any number of other projects.
And we don't know whether those infrastructure projects, because now they are under all these other departments, are actually job creators. I mean, we know that building a pipeline or a new part of Highway Number 1 would create a lot of jobs and in local. But if there's something at border security or Agriculture Canada, which is employing 2 people to look at data or to look at a new program, that may not be having the function of infrastructure projects at all.
Well, and exactly, and the reason I jumped into this was that any government framework has a set of objectives.
Right.
So you first go in and search those, and the Senate committee's done 2 or 3 really good reports on this. And so the infrastructure program, when it was announced and then expanded upon, 12 years, $188 billion. And it made it very clear. The goals and objectives are very clear. Long-term jobs and added value. Like they're stated. And so then, yes, and then you go back and you value. In some cases, baseball diamonds do that.
Right.
And they build community. So yeah, you can legitimize that. But in other cases, perhaps not. But the data needs to be there to make those value judgments.
And sometimes the spending is not clear. Like there might be 50 projects in one province and 10 in another,
Okay.
but those 10 are worth more.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So
yeah.
Saskatchewan, I know, I think that we had a lot of projects, but the value was low, relatively
Exactly.
speaking.
And we've done assessment on that, right? We've
Yeah.
gone across. The other one, the classic, is the road, because I'm from Nova Scotia. The drive to Nova Scotia, you have to go through Quebec.
Mm-hmm.
Between Rivière-du-Loup and Edmundston is a highway that they've been working on since 2004. What's bizarre about that highway, and not bizarre at all, but what it's telling is that 80% of the GDP for the Maritimes, and perhaps even Newfoundland, so Atlantic Canada, goes down that road. And it's taken this long for them to
Right.
build it. Like, could they not have moved infrastructure money around between New Brunswick and gotten it built faster?
Right.
Because you're talking about local economies. That's the type of decision and discussion that you can have when you pull this information up. It's really cool.
One of the things that always comes up in the course of discussions about infrastructure is private-public partnerships. And there's a series of issues there. I mean, obviously, it's very complicated right now. But the other issue I want to raise is because foreign money often comes in. We've seen, I think, a sea change in the Canadian mentality right now, the Canadian mindset. My niece won't buy anything that's produced in China. There's issues around this. Can we do this recovery, this putting Humpty Dumpty back together again? And can we do it domestically? These conversations that always come up, we should be creating our own PPE. We should be doing our things domestically so that we've got control over it when a crisis hits. Can we do that? Do you know?
We just do data, man.
Okay.
But the answer to your question is it has to be a blend. And,
Yeah.
and do we have the authority to comment on that? We pay taxes like everyone else.
Yeah.
We dig deep into this data. Your niece has to be a little careful because she may never go to Canadian Tire again.
Or Walmart or anything else.
But Canadian Tire. And we need people to go to Canadian Tire
Yeah.
because they employ an awful lot of people.
Yeah.
There is a hospital, and I'll bring this closer to home. There is a hospital being constructed in Corner Brook.
Mhm.
Yes, in Newfoundland, the western side of Newfoundland. It is a PPP. And I have no idea the details of it. I can only assume there's foreign money coming into building
Right.
that. You cannot you cannot somehow say that's bad, because that might be the only building that, if anything we've discovered through COVID, that might be the only building going up in Newfoundland for a long time, because they're in such a bad state of affairs.
This is the issue, so that it's there for everyone. So I live in Saskatchewan. We'll talk about the non-funding of grain farmers throughout the whole COVID chaos. There's been no direct money, only an extension of access to credit. What farmers don't need is to be further in debt, even though they might have a longer time to pay for it. We can't sell our canola, one of our major products and exports in Saskatchewan, to China. They've shut it down. We're having some other disagreements with China on a whole range of things. How do we try and shepherd that recovery when there's so many things out of our control, like a country like China shutting down its purchasing? How can we manage these issues? Is there anything in there that's telling you what direction we should be going?
I was talking to an economist in Nova Scotia and about this, about the Bank of Canada and where this is going, and it gets back to your niece a little bit. Mm-hmm. One of the things that there are two winners right now going and coming out of COVID. And they should be applauded. Those individuals who don't have debt. Now, unfortunately, it's a small number of people, as we know. The numbers tell us that.
Right.
But those individuals who saved their money, put it under the mattress, they're in a better position. Those people who have debt are going to have to get more debt. And that goes back to your very earlier question in this. But back to what the economist and I were speaking about, and back to your niece who has this domestic perspective coming at her. I mean, it comes down to, if you have your own garden and you're tending your own affairs, you'll get through this. And if you have the capacity to get your own, it's sustainable. But it's going to be very complicated, because when people say we're going to be in a V-shape recovery, and we're going to, what's the expression, not explode out of this, or we're going to rebound with great.
Yes.
The only way we can rebound is if we take on more debt. I don't, unless somebody finds, and that was the purpose of this week's report we did, and this is data. We're not economists. We looked, and so it goes back to the volatility of small town budgets are based on property tax.
Yeah.
And if you have some insolvency, some layoffs, right?
That's my next point. The only way for government, so we're all going to have to take on more debt, and government's taking on more debt. And really the only way to raise some quick cash is tax. There's nobody left to tax if people aren't working, if they don't have jobs, if the municipalities can't, they can't take blood from a stone. So we just go down this indebtedness road and say, good luck, generation 4 down from here.
And here we are in the basement of some building having this discussion. And the question is, why isn't this discussion being heard on every media outlet in the country? Why isn't it in the papers? Instead of talking about debt ratios, instead of talking about the possibility of a V, we know it's a U recovery, it's a hockey stick recovery.
Yeah.
It's about a month ago, and I watch. I'm a 60-minute CBS 60 Minutes groupie. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, they had the head of Ford, not the head of Ford Canada, but he's one of the Ford family, and he was vice president of X. I don't know, vice president of the board, something. And he said, politics is not going to settle this problem. It's science.
Yeah.
And this gentleman has a car in every driveway, and he's got more skin in the game than all of us, right? And so I don't know, why are we not having a bigger discussion than the 4 of us right here? That's frustrating, because the data's there and it's clear, and we, as you have mentioned in the past, there's enough data.
This is, I guess, what we're going to try and do here with No Nonsense, is kind of have this discussion here. Maybe it's just a small group of us now, but to include more people, because I think we haven't looked forward. We're dealing in the present. We're still playing the blame game about why this happened and all the things we could have done. We need to look at that, but I think more importantly, we need to manage where we're going. Really want to thank you both very much for kicking off this conversation. It's really important.
Oh, it's our pleasure.
Yeah, it is very much. Thank you.
So this was our first test run, a pilot of our podcast. I want to thank Greg and Steve for the No Nonsense conversation, and I want to thank all of you for listening. The whole point of these No Nonsense conversations is to get at the truth, cut through some of the spin, and simplify the complicated. So if you like what you heard, please subscribe for future episodes. I'm Pamela Wallin.